Photosynthesis began in prokaryotes, but when we look at our chloroplasts, we'll see that the light-dependent reactions in photosystems 1 and 2 use energy from light and transfer that to ATP and NADPH, with the Calvin cycle then uses to create carbohydrates from carbon dioxide. So if we start out with these formulas, we can see that carbon dioxide and water produce glucose and oxygen. And that's what we end up using as our big summary reaction. But as we look at some of this, one thing I want you to see here is that this glucose is a carbohydrate. So we think of water, hydrate, carbon. So carbohydrate is what we're looking at, and this is the typical ratio of all carbohydrates. At the end, we'll talk about organic compounds. But as we mess with these formulas a little bit, we start talking about reduction and oxidation. These redox reactions are a bit beyond the scope of AP Bio, but to kind of gloss over a little bit, when we start talking about redox reaction, we talk about oil rig. Oxidation is loss, and we'll be talking about electrons. Oxidation is loss of electrons. Reduction is gaining electrons. So the reason I like this formula here is because we really don't combine carbon dioxide and water. What we're doing is looking at these separate reactions, and water is going to create oxygen here, and carbon dioxide is going to end up creating our glucose at the end. So when we look at these things, we're going to look at them kind of separately, and we're going to spend most of the time with our light-dependent reactions. We also have our Calvin cycle. So this whole endosymbiotic theory, we have original prokaryotes, and they have infoldings, and we get our nucleus. We also get an endomembrane system. This original massive cell takes in some bacteria, which then become mitochondria, and then those also take in chloroplasts. And they don't take in chloroplasts, they gain chloroplasts by absorbing or endocytosis photosynthetic bacteria that already exist, these cyanobacteria. They absorb them and they don't digest them. So that's how we end up getting with our modern plant or algae cells, where we start focusing on our chloroplasts. So again, if we're dissecting a leaf, we would take a cross section here, and we have our xylem and our phloem with our veins. We have our stomata, our little ports where they can breathe through, where they exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen. And then we have all the individual plant cells inside here. And then we have these little green dots inside the plant cells, and that's where we're looking at our chloroplasts. Again, part of this endosymbiotic theory evidence has these idea that it's gaining membranes from the original cell. So when we look at a chloroplast, it has a double outer membrane system, and then it has thylakoid membranes inside there. So we have all these little discs stacked up on top of each other. We have the stacks of thylakoid discs are called granum or grana, and the space around the thylakoids is called the stroma. It's the stroma, not to be confused with stomata or stoma. So as we keep moving on here, again, we break this down into two sets of processes, the light-dependent reactions. And it's in these light-dependent reactions where the water is coming in and we're getting oxygen out. So that's our water and our oxygen. As we get into our Calvin cycle, that's where our carbon dioxide is coming in and we're getting our carbohydrate out. But if we zoom in a little bit, this role of ATP and NADPH is really important. So with our light-dependent reactions, not only is water coming in and oxygen going out, but it's capturing that energy from the sun, storing it into ATP and NADPH, which then gets transferred into our Calvin cycle, where carbon dioxide can use that energy and be powered by that energy to create and store our chemical energy in our carbohydrates. But again, this is a cycle. What are products and what are reactants? The products of the light reactions become reactants in the Calvin cycle, and the products of the Calvin cycle become the reactants in the light reactions. So as we get in here, we're going to start talking about light. Again, it's essential that we're converting this energy from light, and the light has to be absorbed by the chlorophyll. Now, plants are green because they are absorbing mostly red and blue wavelengths of light, and they're reflecting the green and the yellow. The reason why in the fall we start seeing oranges and yellows is because the carotenoids and xanthophylls stick around a bit as the chlorophylls are degraded. But as we're looking at here, we have our chlorophylls here, part of photosystem 1 and 2, and they are going to be capturing that light energy. So we're not actually starting there, because as we start talking about these electrons and what happens with that solar energy, we need to understand where the electrons come from. And it's the breakdown of water and the release of oxygen here. That breakdown of water contributes the electrons to these photosystems. So light is going to energize those electrons, and we have this like stepping down of the electron transport chain here. And what's not shown in this model is how electrons are powering these pumps of moving hydrogen ions or protons across a membrane. But that's where we're ultimately getting our ATP through ATP synthase and the facilitated diffusion of hydrogen ions. But this ATP made in photosystem 2 is going to go to the Calvin cycle. As we're over to photosystem 1, light is going to re-energize these electrons, and then they will be carried also to the Calvin cycle, but they're going to be picked up and carried through NADPH. Another way to look at this is in this diagram. Again, going through those similar kinds of steps, we have water being broken down. In this case, here's our water. It's contributing the electrons to this photosystem. And again, what we're focusing on here with these light-dependent reactions is the water to the oxygen. And oxygen is a byproduct, but what we're really getting out of this is the transfer of light energy to energy in the high energy electrons being carried by NADPH and the energy from ATP. So we start with water supplying the electrons. Those electrons get energized by the light, and the light is represented with this like zaggedy arrow right here. As the electrons are transferred through this electron transport chain, it's powering pumps which are going to move hydrogen ions or protons across this thylakoid membrane. And again, it takes some energy to pump them in here because this is already crowded with hydrogen ions, and it's creating this concentration gradient on the inside. As we progress with these electrons, they are now a lower energy state, and in photosystem 1, the light is going to re-energize these electrons, and these high energy electrons then get carried by NADPH. Finally, we're going to create this ATP here as these hydrogen ions and these protons diffuse through ATP synthase. And ATP synthase is going to be an enzyme, although it is a channel. This enzyme is going to help create ATP from ADP and a free phosphate. This process here, this ATP and NADPH then gets transferred to the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle can be really confusing with all of these long names, which are beyond the scope of what you guys need to know. So as we're looking at this, a big thing to focus on is that energy from the light-dependent reactions is being brought in to the Calvin cycle. And all of this energy from the ATP and the NADPH is ultimately powering the production of carbohydrates from carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is captured, goes and transforms in many different ways, and ultimately we get carbohydrates, organic molecules, but we're focusing mostly on glucose when it comes down to our formula. So again, the formula: carbon dioxide and water produces glucose and oxygen. One thing to think about, again, I've been mentioning it a little bit, is that we're not always getting glucose. That is the idea, is that this G3P becomes glucose. However, this basis, this photosynthesis, is the basis of creating all of our organic compounds, not just sucrose and starch and cellulose, carbohydrates, but we're also getting the basis of fatty acids and amino acids. Of course, other things have to be added here, but this is the basis of our organic compounds within all living things. So this idea, again, last thought here, is that what are products and what are reactants? Again, we're going to get to cellular respiration, and so often we think that um, what are the products become the reactants of the next process. So plants or autotrophs are producing glucose and oxygen, which become the reactants of cellular respiration. And the products of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide and water, become the reactants of photosynthesis. And it's this transfer of energy while we cycle our nutrients. One last thing here, it's not always helpful to only think plants and animals, because plants do contain both chloroplasts and mitochondria. So within one organism, they're going to be doing both processes. They are making carbohydrates to be used within their own mitochondria. So again, we are transferring energy here, but chloroplasts and mitochondria can exist within a single organism. Again, this idea, prokaryotes began photosynthesis, and when we start looking at chloroplasts within eukaryotes, we get our light-dependent reactions, photosystems 1 and 2, taking energy from light, creating ATP and NADPH, which powers the production of carbohydrates from carbon dioxide in the Calvin cycle.